Scwaller from the Temple of Man, the book by R.A.Scwaller de Lubcz. Now I have to preface this with, I just keep saying that this book is probably the most dense and difficult book that I've attempted to study, maybe ever. But in the same sense, it's maybe the most rewarding. If you're of the Western mind, you may not realize how enculturated form, math, logic is built into the intellect. And so human beings are spiritual beings, but we are also here in form. And that's a huge conundrum. And so far, Scwaller de Lubcz may be the most brilliant canon of work to explain both the spiritual nature of man, his mind and energy and emotions and his being, as well as the form of man, anthropocosmos, depending on how you look at it. Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy is that same word, anthropos, meaning man is the measure of the universe. And this is not an arrogant statement. This is, in a strange way, it's actually a very honest and truthful statement. But that doesn't mean that man created the universe. It means that in order for man to understand himself, he has to do it in terms of his own form. And his own form is dictated both physically, or I shouldn't say both, but is dictated physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. So I also want to preface this, I'm about to get into it, but I also want to preface this and just let the listeners know I don't pretend to actually completely understand the stuff in this book. However, the more I read it and the more I work through it, the processing comes a little bit later. I do have the ability to think abstractly, so that helps. But I actually make these videos primarily for myself. I go back and I reflect upon them. I listen to them and I kind of reflect upon them to see how much deeper I can go from my initial thought or my initial reading. So if you want to go deep into the nature of the universe, this book is it, as far as I've been able to find. So here we go. This is a continuance of the pharaonic thinking of number or math. This is called mathematical thought. And this video is basically called the throne of the world. This is the throne of the world and the royal pharaonic throne, symbolized by a square divided into 4. That is, 1 and 3 making 4, with 1/4 being added to the 4 others to make the nomon of 4 to 5. And then here are the figures of the throne of the world. The full side of the throne will be the square root of 5. The square root of 5 less 1 unit equals 2 divided by phi. If the side equals 2, or geometrically, the square root of 5 minus 1. But if the side equals 1, we have a proportion, 1 divided by phi, or the square root of 5 minus 1 divided by 2. And here is the figure as well. So we can see these figures are triangular in nature, and later on he's going to talk about why number itself, so the principle of number in nature, is actually triangular in nature. And this was really strange to me when I first heard it, but we'll revisit it at the end of this video, and I'll explain why number is triangular. You can see in this figure these triangles make squares, cubes, and rectangles. There is an inverse or proportional relationship between right angles and curves. And this is really kind of one of the main points, is that phi is a spiral, and it's a vortex cone, so it's curved. And that is actually the movement, the most common movement in nature. So how does nature employ this? By using form. Well, it does it through right angles or triangulation, meaning squares and cubes. All the positive numbers, all the positive functions are thus summarized in the single symbol of the throne. The mystical function phi the relationship 3 to 4 to 5, the basis of trigonometry, the temporal value that presides over all gestation, the number 1 to 5, in which, by their triangular nature, preside over time, the 9 cosmic temporal principles and their 12 temporal zones in the heavens. Okay, we pause there real quick. 9 cosmic temporal principles and the 12 temporal zones in the heavens. So what he's talking about there is 9 being the number of completion, because there are only 9 numbers, 1 through 9, which makes a perfect spiral. Inversely, well, I should say, inversely and reversely, it makes a perfect spiral, expanding and contracting. And then that's related to the 12 zones of the heavens, which is simply the zodiac, a perfect circle or sphere divided into equal parts of 30 degrees is 12 houses or 12 signs. These are also known as the 12 apostles in the unitary Trinity. This is Christian thinking. We are able to situate a temporal moment in space, but space as volume is only comprehensible to us through the plane, the surface that measures volume. That's pretty important. The cerebral intelligence is planar and not spatial. The intelligence of volume is what the ancients called the intelligence of the heart. All imagination, all linear representation, all description is planar. The parabolic line, for example, is the contour of a section of volume, as is the path traced by the movement of a comet. In this way, we can consider all curves as sectional contours of volume. Okay, you getting that? And he's saying that man's mind, being intellectual, divides things, chops things up, meaning makes right angles. And it's planar in nature, meaning linear. And so we're actually using a linear method to try to map something that is spatial, which is basically unmappable. So this is why spiritual practices, use mystical divination or use transcendental states, transcendental meditations, because they're actually perceiving something that can't be mapped in form and held, but still exists and is absolutely real, meaning the spirit is real. The sacred or divine is real. And we perceive that actually not so much with the mind, but with the heart, the intelligence of the heart. To demonstrate the esoteric sense, we have only the symbol that, through architecture, speaks to us in volume. Analysis shows us 3 directions within a volume, but in reality, 3 planes will never even their displacement or reconstitute a volume. Displacement in the direction of a plane is only an addition of planes, which is pure supposition because planes have no depth. The geometric description of volume by the movement of planes is cinematography, meaning it is an illusion. Our rationalistic mathematics is thus a mass of suppositions by which we bring back to the lower stage of our cerebral consciousness realities experienced a priori, the knowledge of the intelligence of the heart. Okay. What he's saying there is that the principles of numbers, which make up math, are absolutely real. They exist in nature. Man did not make them. That's why there's only 9 numbers or 9 principles. Also known as the netters, which is where we get the word nature. So there are 9 natures created by God or spirit, whatever you want to call it. And we use those numbers as symbols, the symbols are man-made. And we create a language or a description. And what he's saying is that all description is intellectual or planar, meaning has right angles built into it, meaning chops up reality, meaning removes the wholeness of existence. And reality is a whole. It's not in parts, although we can look at it in its parts. The intellect does that. But what he's saying is that the descriptions, all descriptions of the world are actually a negation of knowledge in a strange way. And you can look at the work of Terence McKenna on language or syntax, building and upholding reality, to prove this. And you can also look at the work of Carlos Castaneda with his work on the internal dialogue and the way in which we kindle our reality with life, with our inner talk, our inner speech. Okay, moving on. Pharaonic thought clearly guards against following this path of reduction. The first quality is a volume, a space defined within time. A sectioned volume appears as a plane, but in order to make a volume, one must assemble other volumes. Moses said, "And God made the expanse." Now Moses was initiated in Egypt, and he took the knowledge with him. So there we go. The esoteric meanings of biblical scriptures, the expanse, meaning volume or intelligence of the heart or the knowledge within, because he took the knowledge with him. That's what it means. While 1 divided by phi squared appears to us as a plane, the unity in which phi acts is space. In numbers, the first square is 4, and the first volume is 8. The root of 4 is 2, and half of 4 is 2, and 2 is the cube root of 8. So there we see the triangulation. This is why number is triangular. The connection between verse and inverse, root and number, is actually a triangulation. Those right angles map a curve eventually, which is the spiral, but we'll get back to that. We write 1 divided by phi squared as 0.381966, half of which is 0.19098, the number 19.098, which equals 6.18 squared, which we can round off as 19, is the nature of phi. Now this pilot number and the mystical number phi engender only those numbers that are functions of phi. And since the entire universe results from this function, all will be proportioned by this function, whether it be the human being, plant, or the genesis of the mineral, or time, or sizes, distances of the stars. There you go, right there. I mean, in one paragraph, he basically shows you the irrational use of math in today's modern science, because they have forgotten that all these numbers are actually proportions of one movement of the universe, which is phi. So it's very hard to explain, but all form is not actually, there are no forms that are causal in nature. There are no natural causal forms. The actual cause, which was we talked about in my last video on pharaonic math, the actual cause is the split of pi, the pHIs, the splitting. The first motion is actually a curved motion, and all form comes out of that. So let me try to wrap this up by saying that all form is an effect of a cause known as phi. Okay, continuing on. Consequently, it is important to establish fundamental values in order to provide a solid foundation for the construction of this thought. It is necessary to regard phi as the numerical symbol of the creative function and of procreation, and not as quantity. It is this function that proportions things, distinguishes them, qualifies them, and situates them. It is the action of tum, T-U-M. It is the fire animating all life, the seed that specifies the indeterminate nutritive substance, the male solar action of the spermatozoon, the symbol of the hermetics, the verb acting in God, the verb of the Gospel of John. So the verb is Latin for word. So in the beginning was the word. So when they're talking about the Gospel of John, it's basically sound is actually creating light. Light is thus creating form. So the first spiritual movement is actually sound. And I'll just kind of syncretize this other thought. This is why cymatics works perfectly. Cymatics is the study of sound, but in harmonic frequencies makes perfect geometric forms or shapes. Pretty obvious. You can do this. You can easily do this yourself. I mean, you can just Google cymatics and look at the perfect balanced geometric forms at 432 hertz or there's so many other frequencies. That's just the heart one. But this is not a coincidence that nature does this. Nature is actually expressing itself through form, and form is the effect, not the cause. So this is why sound creates light and light creates form. And you can go back and the German, God, I forgot his name, the German acoustics scientist that discovered cymatics, I forgot his name, but he did it by playing a violin bow on the edge of a brass plate, and he put sand on the plate. He played the violin bow, and the different tones around the edges actually moved the sand into perfectly symmetrical geometric shapes. And we've been studying that ever since. So how he thought to do this is beyond me, but fascinating stuff. Moving on. The numbers 1, 2, 4, and 8 are the names respectively of the point and the line that is movement, the first divisible number, then the surface, that is, the enumerated number, and finally, the volume, that is, the space, 1, limited in quantity. Volume is space contracted, coagulated into its form by the action of phi. So that's kind of what I was trying to get at. He just said it so much better than me. Volume is space contracted, coagulated into form by the action of phi. So the form would be the 9 numbers and their geometric shapes. But the action that causes them is actually phi contracting space or coagulating it. And I'll just, another aside here, I'm going to keep linking these other things. The work of Walter Russell is absolutely 100% coherent and is saying the exact same thing that Scwaller de Lubcz is saying here. And I wouldn't be surprised if Walter Russell actually studied the work of Scwaller when he was alive. The cubic waveform model, which is a far superior model to atomic physics, a more accurate model to what's going on in the world of science or physics, is basically saying this, that's why it's called a cubic waveform. It's like, how do we get a wave or a spiraling vortex cone from the shape of a cube? Well, we have it right here in pharaonic thought. It's the phi is the spiral, but number actually works in triangulation, those right angles. So thus you have a cube with corners and edges, surfaces and planes, because man thinks in planar terms. That's how we're able to try to map or attempt to map what's going on in the universe and sort of reason it or rationalize it. We use the intellect, the cornered mind, and in order to see how Russell did it by it's anode and cathode planes, starting from the center, a stillness of a cube, and in moving out in both directions, perfectly balanced, male, female, magnetic still light, which causes electric wave currents to go from corner to corner of the cube. I know that sounds strange, but look up Walter Russell and the cubic waveform model. If you can conceptualize that, you'll be a step ahead of like every mainstream atomic physicist on Earth. So the cube actually is how we are able to extrapolate and represent the wave. Because as we'll find out later, we have to look at things in their inverse in order to see what's really going on. Okay, moving on. The action of phi within the human spermatozoa causes the human form, and its gestation is a coagulation of spatial substance into temporal situations, dividing itself into embryonic phases in a temporal relation with a cosmic gestation. Although the activity of phi is universal, it is uniform. Variety cannot be caused either by coagulating substance or by the action of phi. Variety is produced by the succession of moments with a single genesis that, for us, has its finality in man. Thus, all forms are situated between a term that is the first universal form of this final form, having present man as its form. The first form is thus potentially man, and each moment of this genesis is a specificity that is contained and summarized in man, whether it be an atomic moment, or a geological, or a plant, or an animal moment. This succession, each moment of which has a name, constitutes the sequence of natural numbers, the nature, the character, the kinships, the relationships, and the proportions proper to these moments, the things contained in the human genesis. Okay, that's basically a big way of talking about the anthropomos. This is basically saying that man's ability to be conscious of himself is due to the reflection of the nature in which he is born, meaning planet Earth and its situation in the solar system and the cosmos. And this is how man is the measure of the universe. It's through his own consciousness he's able to perceive his own proportions, meaning his own body and the 12 systems that it's built on, the temple, all of its angles, all of its math, all of its movements, all of its spiraling, breathing, all of its form, and using that to create a language to measure the reality of the universe in which he sees. Meaning, for example, in the temples, like say in Luxor, or even in Giza, in the king and queen's chambers, you go into a room and there'll be one object in it, maybe a sarcophagus, or sometimes it's just a block, cube on the floor. And for a long time, Egyptologists haven't woken up yet, and they haven't figured out, well, why is this empty room here with no artwork on it describing what it is, and there's this cube on the floor? Well, it's the pharaonic math. The pharaohs, or the people, actually, I don't want to say the pharaohs, but the people who built those pyramids are trying to show you the proportions of the universe, or I should say the proportions of nature. So that cube that's on the floor, or that sarcophagus, is actually in a direct proportional relationship to the rest of the room. And there are sound harmonics, and then of course light harmonics that are built from that actual number, or that ratio. And so what they're trying to show you is, when you go into this room, it's built up of this many cubes, or this many qubits, and the relationship between the contractions of space, the contracting or coagulating volume of space. The tones that they make are actually the same exact tones that make the human body. So this is how man's human body is the measure of the universe. This is why man has the potential to be transcendental, to be aware of his spirit. Moving on. The 9 numbers of I can never say this word, the tetrax. I think that's how you say it. The 9 members of the tetrax surrounding the unity are the 9 transcendental powers, or numbers characterizing the modes of action. The 12 numbers around the original ternary in the 5th triangle define the 12 divisions of time. Okay, that's basically saying what I said before. There are only 9 numbers. There's a relationship between them, a proportion to a perfect sphere or circle, which divided equally is 12 houses. And that relationship is actually encoded in that relationship is actually time, the way man perceives past, present, and future. And well, we'll get into this later, but Nikola Tesla also spoke about this when he talked about the secrets of the universe being in the wave, and more directly in the numbers 3, 6, and 9. The volume is this form, but the perfect sphere has no form. It is the amniotic sac containing all. It is the transcendental form of the volume, just as unity is the transcendental number for the numerated numbers. It represents the first expanse. Notice the terminology here. He uses amniotic sac being the form of no form, the perfect sphere that really has no boundaries. Because the reason why Scwaller is using this terminology is because it's human. It's directly related to the human body. Like, how does the human body know how to create a womb and then create a sac in order to gestate and grow and create a new life? Think about that. Gestation is a hermetic teaching. It's this is why the science is so spiritual as well as scientific. It's a balance between the philosophy and the form. And the form, again, being the human body. The human body is the temple. The surface, which appears to us as the limit of a form or section form, is the definition of the size of that form. The definition is temporal, meaning time. That is present and is not definitive. It is the numerated number itself, variable in time. This is why all forms or all bodies dissolve, because it is temporal, meaning all form only exists in time. So if you watch anything coming to existence, if you watch it long enough, it will dissolve and go back to its source, which is formlessness. Essentially, number is triangular and remains so through all the forms that are composed of this triangular principle. Similarly, the volume, form, can only be composed of volumes. The surface, being the measure of sizes of the volume of form, can only be composed of surfaces. It is through the mystery of the ternary that the transcendent unity becomes actual, and it is by the duality in the ternary that the unity becomes the measure of the thing. The surface, 3 times 3 times 3, defining the volume, and 2 times 2, defining the surface. All he's saying there is that 3 dimensions is only perceived once you're in 2 dimensions. And once you're in 3 dimensions, then you can perceive the infinite expanse, which I would call 4D, 4 dimensions. The first form, or the form volume, results from the action of phi within 1. It is written 1 to 1 over phi to 1 over phi squared. We can also write it as 1 divided by 1 in sequence to 1 divided by phi in sequence to 1 divided by phi squared, being the proportion 1 phi squared. This corresponds to the squares of the sides of a triangle of the vertical half section of the pyramid of Cheops. The base equals 1, the height equals the square root of phi, the slope or apothem equals phi. Their squares are respectively 1 phi squared. Okay, that's crazy stuff. I'll try to draw this and show you what it's about. Just understanding that language is, it's very difficult. Phi and proportion and number and, pharaonic math. The first surface of the action of phi within. The first surface of the action of phi within 1 is the dualization of this unity, and 1 over phi, and 1 over phi squared. Now, the sum as the product of phi and phi squared is phi cubed in negative or inverse numbers. The sum equals 1, and the product equals 1 over phi cubed to the 16th power. Holy moly. Now, this is the sum that makes 1, being like the addition of 2 parts of 1. With regard to the pyramid of Cheops, the sum of the squares of the height and the hypotenuse of its triangle is also phi plus phi squared equals phi cubed. Then the unity of the base is either phi cubed divided by phi cubed equals 1 as a positive number, or 1, the transcendental number. And when I say 1, the transcendental number, go back to my last video on pharaonic math, and it goes through the 9 principles, or the 9 netters, or the nine numbers, and shows you that there's actually only one irrational number, and that is the number 1, or transcendental number. All the other transcendental / irrational numbers are not actual numbers, they're proportions or ratios. One of these gives a positive number for the cube, and the other a negative number for the unity, that is space. Okay. What he's saying here is that the language will work either way in inverse. If you give the cube or the form existent, like it's real, then you're giving it a positive number, and you're giving the space around it sort of a transcendental or an idyllic nuance to it. But you can do the reverse. You could say that form is actually not real, but formlessness is actually real because it's eternal. So it just depends on the language that you're using. But that's what he's saying, is that the important thing to realize here is that there's a relationship between form and formlessness, and there's a relationship between number and its triangulation forming an eternal spiral. So there's a relationship between time and space. They are defined in terms of each other, but it's hard to say, well, this one's real and that one's not. So you could actually say, time is real and space is not, or you could easily just say space is real and time is not. You could say form is real and formlessness is not, or you could say formlessness is actually the real thing, and form is not. Hopefully you guys are following this. It's heavy, I know. Okay. With regard to the pyramids, in negative or inverse numbers, the square plus its root equals 1. In positive numbers, the square plus its root equals cube. One materializes the other, giving it form. The surface measures the volume, but has no volume itself. So, what he's getting at there is that in order for us to perceive a volume of space, we have to encapsulate it. We have to enclose it. And the actual way in which we would measure an enclosure would be through triangulation, meaning we'd have to build a cube. And again, this is where Walter Russell gets his cubic waveform model. So he's saying that the cube is actually not real, but it's just the language in which we have constructed to describe what is real. It's sort of the same thing, like all descriptions of the world are sort of negating the knowledge of the world. The number line, understood in its esoteric sense, is movement. It is the exoteric sense. Movement is a displacement in space and in time. This is an objective analysis of that which is esoterically termed duration, or a vital movement. Unity alone is absolute duration. Any other duration is conditioned by a beginning and an end. It is a fraction of the absolute duration. The impulse of the beginning reaches its conclusion, potentially implied finality that is the seed of its species. So what he's saying really is that, in a sense, time or duration is an illusion because we're looking at a fraction or a part of a whole. And he's really saying that the only thing that is really in duration or really eternal is something without boundaries, something that is not broken up into time, basically. Duration is the esoteric movement, is thus the continuity in and of itself, represented by the prime numbers such as 1, 3, 5, 7, 11, 3, 17, and 19. Each one of these numbers is comparable to a species that perpetuates itself through the individual. And then another aside real quick here is those numbers there, those prime numbers, if you look at 17 encodes a proportion of the initial split of the first form of sacred geometry, which is called the Vesica Pisces. So when you look at the Vesica Pisces, you find the first ratio that comes from it, from 1 dividing itself into 2, and you get the Vesica Pisces, or the womb, or the thing that looks like a fish, or the female vagina. And there's a proportion from its height to its width, and that proportion is 1:5:3. Okay? That 1:5:3 is mentioned in the Bible as Jesus is on the banks, and the guys are fishing in the boat. They're not catching fish. He tells them, to cast the net on the right side, meaning the right side of the brain, meaning your intuitive side, and they pull up 153 fish. Now, this story is not meant to be taken literally. It is a sacred geometric encoding, and we know this to be true because it's mentioned in other parts of the Bible as well. So anyway, my point is that the 17th prime number marks the only number that can be cubed and then equal itself, which is 1:5:3. And it's that proportion of the first movement in sacred geometry. It's also built into the 17th course of the Pyramid of Giza. There's a reason why you enter the Queen's Chamber from the 17th course. And it's that again. It's all encoding this pharaonic math. Okay. The number line is the Father, and at the same time the Son of surfaces measuring a volume. In a solid, it is represented by the edge. Movement, in the sense of exoteric duration, is the complement, the opposition to the coagulating action of phi. The function phi reduces the space 1 into volume. Movement fights this reduction by trying to force apart again this contracted space. What he's really saying there, I can best explain again by Walter Russell's cubic waveform model. Walter Russell talks about gravitation and radiation, which is basically expansion and contraction, and that the cube is constantly trying to push itself out to become a sphere, and the sphere is constantly trying to pull itself in to become a perfect triangulated cube. And there's this interplay between the two, and that's called the universe. That's the movement of the universe. That's how space, time, duration, perception, past, present, future, form all come into being. And we being beings, we perceive all of that because we're in form. So we're right in the middle of that contraction and expansion, that inhale and that exhale. And this is why stillness is so important to all of us that are self-conscious. It basically provides us with a reset or an equilibrium, a way to decompress, no pun intended. So it's just good to know that that's what he's talking about here. Scwaller is talking about that expansion and contraction, that coagulation of oneness, pure openness. In physics, the activity phi appears thus as the centripetal magnetic force in opposition to the centrifugal electric effect. The centrifugal effect is equatorial. Therefore, it is a plane delimited by a circuit. This circle is not a line. Neither is the disk a surface. The circle is a circuit and, as such, is vitally never closed. The linear function phi is represented as a spiral of the function phi progressively moving toward its own center, which determines a surface phi squared equaling phi plus 1, in opposition to phi squared minus 1 equaling phi. The graphic representation is the opposite of the direction of the action, in which phi plus 1 is a concentration, whereas phi squared minus 1 is a dispersal. Same thing. He's just showing you here in the form, in the actual, like the throne of the world. He's showing you in actual Platonic shape, Platonic form, and math and geometry, the relationship between existence and non-existence. And phi is the function, the movement that creates all of this. And the reason why I'm making this video is because modern science has left out phi. Even though we know this to be true, we see it in phyllotaxis, we see it in the human body, we see it in water, we see it in wind, we see it in waves, we see it in planets, we see it in light, we see it in microwaves, gamma waves, X-rays. We see it everywhere in nature, and yet science still has couched themselves in atomic thinking, atomic physics. But let's not forget where the word atom comes from. Atomic, Adam, atum, A-T-U-M. It all goes back to the pharaonic thinking. We've just been duped. We've been lost since Newton and Einstein to this atomic physics, which is just explosion-based technology. It's just a profit model. It's not a model of reality. Okay, finishing up. How could we carve a duration out of eternity? Either eternity is an illusion formed of juxtaposition of durations, or the duration is an apparent fraction of eternity, appearing and disappearing as a form. Now, nothing allows the notion of duration. Thus, the appearance of an existence for a time, with a beginning and without end, is precisely the notion of continuity. It imposes the consciousness of a before and an after. The irrational consciousness of the eternal is what forms the psychological consciousness of duration. The eternal could then be symbolized as a thread assumed to be without beginning or end, forming nodes or temporary appearances, limited in duration on the continuity. This is symbolized by the chen, or the cartouche, the set of initials imprisoned in the ren, or the name. The number line can serve as an example to demonstrate the contradictory character of the simultaneity of the complements and the exoteric and esoteric aspects. It is therefore impossible to represent the function graphically without reversing it. Okay. Again, he's just saying that language is absolutely necessary to describe the world, but it's built into it is its own limitation, meaning you can't describe the name without imprisoning it in a symbol or a symbolique. You can't take a concept or an idea and not conceptualize it in form, meaning words, letters, writing, hieroglyphs, or architecture. So it's just good to know that built into our language is a limitation, as well as being able to see the inverse of the symbol. Hopefully you guys like this. If anybody is truly interested in Egyptology, there's really no better book than The Temple of Man, R.A.Scwaller de Lubcz. Thank you. Please share.